Hello, welcome everyone. We're just starting with the session now. Just as a reminder for those joining us today that the session is being broadcasted live through our Facebook and YouTube accounts, which you can see on the chat. I would also like to remind the participants that the session is being recorded. As a matter of order, the session will be carried out in English through the channels as well as in this session. However, if you need access to translation during the Zoom session of our event, you can access at the bottom right of your screen, you will see the icon that resembles a globe. You can click on this icon and select the language into which you would like the session to be translated, and our interpreter will provide a real-time translation of the language of your choice. Also, throughout the session, we will have live interactions through a platform called Slido. The platform will introduce questions during the webinar, which you can answer through a text box available in the platform. You can find the link as we go through the session in the chat. We would encourage all participants to answer this question, and it would allow us to have a more interactive dialogue with those joining us today. Other than that, I would like to welcome everyone for the regardless of the time zone you find yourselves in, whether it's dawn, the warm noon, or evening. I extend a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first of 3 webinar series titled Key Drivers of Change that Affect Livestock Systems and Their Impact on Sustainability and Resilience. These webinars are being organized by the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, GASL, a multi-stakeholder partnership recognized for facilitating dialogue, sharing good practices and policies, and promoting that sustainability of global livestock sector, with the support of the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education Center, hereinafter referred to as CATIE for its acronyms in Spanish. This is an academic center for innovation and sustainable development in topics related to agriculture, management, conservation, and sustainable use of natural resources. This webinar that begins today is a crucial space for dialogue and collective reflection. The drivers of change in the livestock sector are diverse and complex, ranging from environmental aspects to technological advancements and socioeconomic dynamics. By bringing together experts, academic professionals, decision makers, we aim to build a clear picture of how these drivers are impacting our practices and how can we strategically respond. My name is Mariel Merayo, and I will be your host for today's insightful session. So in today's session specifically, we're delving into the realm of environmental and technological innovation drivers that are influencing the landscape of livestock systems. We have a packed agenda with esteemed keynote speakers and panelists, and who will share their perspectives on these crucial topics. Indeed, environmental and technological innovation drivers are revolutionizing the livestock sector, creating new possibilities and challenges. Technological advancements are shaping novel products such as plant-based meats and lab-grown alternatives. And these innovations, in fact, can redefine the industry's practice and impact. Before we dive into our agenda, let me provide you with a brief overview of the methodology of the session today. We will begin with a welcome address from Ms. Shirley Tarawali, Chair of GASL, who will commence our welcome address, followed by Mr. Mohamed Ibrahim, Director of CATIE. The webinar has been structured in 2 sections. The first section will delve into elements related to environmental drivers, followed by a panel aimed at complementing the key ideas presented by our keynote speaker. Following a brief intermission, we will address technological innovation drivers. And at the conclusion of the event, we will open the floor for discussion. As I said before, we encourage you to continuously participate through the platform Slido, featuring the questions we have prepared for you, the links we will be sharing in the chat as we go along, and we look forward to receiving numerous interactions through this platform. So now let us extend a welcome to Ms. Shirley Tarawali. She's Chair of GASL, Assistant Director General of the International Livestock Research Institute based in Nairobi, Kenya. She's Chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. Ms. Tarawali will commence with our welcome address, and we will then be followed by Mr. Mohamed Ibrahim, who is Director General of CATIE. He's a Doctor of Agricultural and Environmental Science with more than 26 years research experience in livestock and environment, and he has contributed to generating knowledge on silvopastoral systems, quantification of economic services in these systems, which are being used in the development of policies for climate-smart livestock systems. Having been introduced our two speakers, I will now give the floor to Ms. Tarawali. Just a reminder, you have 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good day to everybody. And thank you so much for joining this online webinar that is one of a series of 3 webinars exploring drivers in relation to livestock systems. And as you've heard, these webinars are organized jointly by the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, or GASL, with CATIE, the Tropical Research and Higher Education Center based in Costa Rica. At this juncture, I really want to begin by saying a huge thank you to our colleagues at CATIE, as well as the GASL Secretariat, supported by FAO in Rome, for making this webinar series happen. Thank you too to all the speakers and panelists, and to everyone who's made time to join what I hope will be a rich and stimulating, as well as action-oriented series of discussions. As you've heard, my name is Shirley Tarawali. I'm Chair of the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock, GASL, and Assistant Director for ILRI, based in Kenya. I'm just going to take a few minutes, I don't think it's going to be 10, to frame what the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock is, what its ambitions are, and how this series of webinars relates. So firstly, the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock is a unique multi-stakeholder partnership that brings together all typologies of livestock stakeholders, from smallholders to commercial and everything in between. Brings together different organizations, NGOs, governments, academia, public and private sector, civil society, and multilateral organizations. So through this rather unique adding together role, GASL works to assemble evidence, to foster dialogue and consensus around livestock-related issues, to support practice and policy change towards sustainable livestock solutions that contribute to development ambitions, as well described in the GASL vision that says, by 2030, sustainable, inclusive, resilient, and diverse livestock systems across the world contribute significantly to sustainable development goals of the UN Agenda 2030 and are integral to sustainable food systems. Achieving this vision is framed around 4 sustainability domains. And these are food and nutrition security, livelihoods and economic growth, animal health and welfare, and climate and natural resource use. One of the key ways that we work as GASL to create opportunities for this diversity of livestock stakeholders, the many systems and environments that they represent, to come together and identify actions that support more sustainable and resilient livestock systems, and in turn, more sustainable and resilient food systems and better development outcomes, is through a multi-stakeholder partnership meeting, usually held in a different location around the world. This year's meeting is themed multi-stakeholder collaboration to strengthen sustainability and resilience of livestock systems in response to drivers of change. And it'll take place in Chiang Mai in Thailand towards the end of October. The global meeting will be preceded by a series of 8 regional consultations that provide an opportunity for regional livestock stakeholders to explore how different drivers impact on livestock systems, and how and where a multi-stakeholder approach in each region could foster greater sustainability and resilience. I think while we're well aware that there's multiple drivers that impact livestock systems and which are and indeed must continue to be addressed, these things like population growth, urbanization, increasing incomes, concerns about livestock, environmental and health impacts, these are perhaps to some extent what we might call slow drivers. They've been recognized and they've been evolving over many decades. But this year we recognize that the world has and continues to grapple with many, perhaps we could call them unexpected or sudden and dramatic in some cases drivers of change that have major implications for every aspect of life, including for livestock systems. The climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and a slate of new technologies, and so on. So to better prepare for the regional and global multi-stakeholder consultations, and to ensure that the actions and solutions arising out of these are well informed, we commissioned this series of webinars, bringing together experts such as yourselves from across the world to provide their views on key drivers, what these mean for the 4 sustainability domains, and how GASL's unique multi-stakeholder nature can support greater livestock sustainability and resilience and its contribution to those broader development ambitions. The drivers we identified for the 3 webinars are environmental and technical innovation drivers, health and disease drivers, and geopolitical and socioeconomic drivers. So again, a very warm welcome. I hope you will find this a rich and informative session. And again, my thanks to all who have made it possible and to all who are taking part today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Tarwali, for your words. Before I give the floor to Mr. Ibrahim, I would like to remind everyone that we have already enabled the Slido, which would allow us to contribute to what is, as Ms. Tarwali mentioned, what do you think is the most influential environmental driver affecting the livestock system? We would love to hear your inputs through the platform. And I will now give the floor to Mr. Ibrahim for the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, based on where you are. First of all, let me thank Dr. Shirley Tarwali from the Global Agenda and Dr. Eduardo Arce, for organizing this meeting, and also the team of the Livestock and Environmental Units of CATI for advancing in the first webinar. We've been working with the FAO and the lead initiative with Dr. Henning Steinfeld for many years, which we started the discussion about livestock and environment, and which is now advanced beyond livestock and environmental issues in terms of transformation of food systems, and also in close collaboration with LILRI, with CIRAD, with many of the international CGIAR centers, and also regional centers to look at the transformation of the developing sustainable livestock systems. As you probably know, in Latin America, livestock systems are very important, but has been on the discussion in terms of the environmental degradation and ecological footprint, which we're going to discuss today. And CATI has been a pioneering institution, is a relatively small institution that has been working with its networks, looking at a transdisciplinary approach in terms of how do we work from system research and a landscape approach to look at sustainable intensification of livestock systems, while at the same time looking at the provisioning of ecosystem services and building resilience. We've also incorporated a gender approach using the experiences already that ILRI has worked on, with tools being developed, and advance also in testing finance and ecosystem services payment as a tool for enhancing the adoption and scaling up of sustainable practices for livestock systems. Our approach has been looking at research, but also looking at building capacity. CATI has a university systems, which we offer training at the higher education Many of our graduates are working in the institutions, but also strengthening the extension services and new concepts, new tools, what is required for enhancing the changes that we need at a local scale, national and regional scale. We've also been working at policy and advocacy from a regional level with the CCAD, for example, in Central America, or the CAC, which is a Commission for Agriculture Ministries, but also working in the COP in terms of how do we build advocacy in terms of providing the knowledge and information that people need for their decision making. So in synthesis, I think our institution is well committed to work with the FAO, with the organizations, with the Global Agenda, Livestock, to discuss the issues, but also to look at the programs for implementation. And in my discussion today, I'm going to make some presentations. So briefly, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting Kathy, but also we're going to make a synthesis of what is the outcomes of this webinar and to provide information for continued discussion in this team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ibrahim, for your words. Indeed, you set the stage of the important initiatives both by Gassel and Katia. Thank you very much. Now, as we move forward, we'll set the stage for our discussion of today with a few words by Dr. Henning Steinfeld. He is a German agricultural economist, currently serves as a consultant for Gassel, and previously headed the livestock sector analysis and policy branch at FAO in Rome. He brings extensive expertise in agricultural and livestock policy with a particular focus on environmental issues, poverty alleviation, and public health. Furthermore, he is author of key books related to the themes of the webinar series named Livestock Long Shadow and Livestock in Changing Landscape. He will share insights on change drivers and their influence on the livestock sector's sustainability, both regional and globally. Mr. Steinfeld, you now have 15 minutes, and I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left. You have the floor now.
Thank you, Marielle. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you also, Shirley and Mohamed, for the introduction to this webinar. I have been asked to just provide some initial thoughts of how we may want to approach the question of drivers in livestock system change. And the presentation I have not made specifically to today's webinar, Environment and Technology, but for the set of 3 webinars that are being conducted by Kati. So the discussion about why the Global Agenda took the issue of drivers was the observation I think many of us make today and these days, that the pace of change has become very rapid, is accelerating, and there is a growing uncertainty of what the future looks like. We are amidst multiple crises. I think Shirley has already outlined them quite well. We've had the pandemic, and countries are still struggling in the aftermath of the pandemic. There's the risk of new pandemics as well. There's an ongoing war in Europe, which hasn't been the case for 70 years, and stronger or accentuated geopolitical tensions. We've had a series of climate events this year, which actually scared many of us because climate change has come close and has hit us personally. Environmental degradation is also ongoing and, in fact, accelerating in many areas. At the same time, and important to organizations like CATI and FAO, there's growing inequality and a lack of participation of less advantaged groups around the world, actually. Inflation and debt is rising, and important also to the global agenda, the 2030 objectives, the SDG objectives, which are also at the basis of the global agenda, is massively off track. So it gives the feeling of a growing instability and risk of disruption. And I think Shirley has already alluded to it, the global agenda could have a role to chart and identify pathways of how livestock systems may adjust and transform, with the overall objective to improve resilience and sustainability. Next one, please. So the methods or the pillars, the methodological pillars that we choose to propose, are very simple actually, a model that has been developed, I think 30 years ago, here simplified. The drivers that we observe that are impacting on livestock systems change the state of these livestock systems to the better or to the worse. And then society, policymakers, producers come up usually with a response to the change that they observe they are being hit with. So very simple, the drivers change something and there's a reaction to that change. And we would like to propose to follow an agri-food systems approach where we not only look at primary production, but we consider the linkages both forward and backward, that we look at feed, at energy, at land use change, that we look at also what is happening in the post-harvest areas, the consumption, the retailing, the waste, and also bring together in a transdisciplinary fashion those technical scientific disciplines that relate to the subject. So biophysical, chemistry, health, economics, social sciences, they all need to come together to better understand how these agri-food systems work and how they may want to respond to the changes that are happening. And the third one that we propose is that we do that keeping in mind what over the years Global Agenda has developed in terms of the sustainability domains. They have already been mentioned by Shirley: food and nutrition security, livelihoods and economic growth, climate and resource use, and animal health and welfare. Okay, so let me just list some issues that have been listed under these domains. So the drivers of change for what regards climate and resource use are growing resource scarcity, which affect many livestock producers around the world. Land, water, biodiversity, nutrients, all are becoming scarce in some way. The issue of diseases and drivers, diseases as drivers, and also the role of ecosystem degradation in ecological change and the emergence and spread of diseases. Climate change itself is a driver, of course. Heat, droughts, flooding, fire, they all affect many producers, many systems around the world, and have already, irrespective of what you believe about human-made climate change or not, there is already a need to adapt in almost every location. And then in many countries around the world, policies are being designed to reduce emissions, and that these may also affect livestock systems. Next one, please. Under animal health and welfare, what are the drivers of change that have been mentioned? So the emergence and spread of diseases, of course, also linked to changing ecologies and climate change. Food safety as an issue that has the potential also to drive change. Antimicrobial resistance related to this, but is still and actually growing as an issue in many production and livestock systems. The emergence and innovation with regards to new treatments of diseases and vaccine development could also be a driver of change. And consumer orientation and what people who eat livestock products think about animal health and welfare is also a growing driver, particularly also in connection with social media. Next one, please. Technologies, I think there's a mix up here. Technologies is not one of our 4 domains. But there are drivers of change that cut across these different four domains. So digitalization, ongoing since 30 years, but rapid acceleration just recently through machine learning, but also robots are finding their way into livestock systems, not only processing and retailing and so on, but also production itself. Big data, of course, is another issue. Recent revolutionary developments in genomics, I think, have also the potential to be of disruptive energy, could be a driver of change. And then what has already been mentioned, that in some ways alternatives are being developed to replace conventional livestock products. Next one, please. I think there's a mix-up of my slides, but I will just continue. When we look at these drivers of change, then I think we should be a little careful of how we look at them. Drivers have a certain direction. They move from A to B, but they can do so in a straight line or in a curve. And here we really need to look at how does this driver look like? Is this a slow moving one, linear one? I think Shirley mentioned it with regard to the expansion of demand over the last 70 years. Exponential, you look at diseases, they behave in an exponential way. Climate change behaves in an exponential way. So I think we need to differentiate or look carefully at how these drivers actually move. I think we also need to look at the time scale of change. Is this a short mover or is this a long-term mover? And we need to look at the space scale of change. So is this just a local change or is this something bigger? You know, I think until about 5 years ago, maybe we looked at El Nino as something local, but we now understand it is actually global. So then the interaction among those drivers, some of these drivers, they help each other, they support each other, and others are antagonistic. They don't get along and they fight. So how do the drivers relate to each other? And what is the energy that is expended in the process? And I think we shouldn't forget that while these livestock systems are driven by the drivers, they're also drivers themselves. So they exert the force on other systems, on other participants somewhere down the line, which I think we should also be aware of. Next one, please. So these are the drivers. What is being hit by these drivers are the livestock systems. I think the strength of the global agenda, Shirley has already mentioned it, is in fact the diversity of livestock systems, and we recognize this. So these systems, they react in different ways to these drivers. There's different exposure. Some may be able to insulate themselves from these drivers quite well, whereas others are really exposed and without alternatives. So the coping mechanism and how these systems can actually deal with these drivers is quite different. And I think that should be reflected in our thinking. So the response, the last element of the method, so to say, just briefly what has been mentioned here, I think it is important to underline that solutions are not just one-off fix. It is usually a process that combines many different elements and that need to be pulled together in order to get to the desired change. So these processes involve the generation of technologies, institutional reform, the sharing of costs and benefits, subsidies, taxes, payment for environmental services, carbon credits, you name it, to resolve conflicting objectives and trade-offs, because we shouldn't be naive here. I think it is quite clear that they are going to be winners and losers, and not all losers will be able to issues can be addressed at all levels. And it is important, a mandate also for the global agenda, to see how does this new situation affect the type of dialogue that needs to be kept ongoing in order to drive towards sustainability. Next one, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Steinfeld, for giving us an insight into those drivers and specifically what are those responses, right? Definitely multi-sectoral approaches are one of the reasons why we're here and one of the main reasons we're looking at solutions as a collective. And we have been receiving throughout your intervention some comments through our Slido. Indeed, what do people think are the most influential environmental drivers affecting the livestock? And we have received many answers, but indeed the main one we can see or the main elements people are agreeing on is that the main issue is climate change, of course. We have also land change use and GHG emissions, but as you can see, there are other elements which people consider are the most influential drivers affecting livestock systems. Thank you very much for everyone who has participated in the Slido so far. This allows us to have a more interactive dialogue on what you think are the main elements of discussion today. This allows us also to introduce our next question. You will find the link through the chat and you will be able to see what the next question is. We encourage you to participate throughout our next intervention and you can include comments at any point then. We will now that Mr. Steinfeld has set the scene for the main elements that are shaping the livestock sector, we will begin with our first thematic segment that delves into the status of environmental drivers impacting livestock systems. We're honored to have again Mr. Mohamed Ibrahim, Director of CATIE, as our keynote speaker for this segment, followed by an expert panel. Mr. Ibrahim will provide a comprehensive overview of the current environmental drivers of change in the livestock sector. Mr. Ibrahim will be speaking for the next 20 minutes. Mr. Ibrahim, I will let you know when you have 5 minutes left. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the status of environmental drivers, and I would like to acknowledge that many researchers have published in this team and some are on the panel today. And what I've done is to try to make a compilation of some of the work they've been published to use this as a source for discussion. Now, the whole discussion about livestock and environment and the whole food systems is related to what is being now advanced in the Anthropocene on the planetary boundaries and where do we see the limits and the safe operating space as it relates to biosphere, integrity, climate change, biodiversity, climate, water, etc. And this is what has been triggering the discussion about advancing in a One Health approach, looking at the health of the planet and the health of people and the ecosystems. It was also advanced in terms of what the Eat Lancet report published recently, a second version of healthy diets and what are the relationship between healthy diets and the boundaries. And of course, this brings to the attention of the discussion about livestock meat and milk consumption and the relationship in terms of health, but also in the relationships of the planet. But there are good results, and we need to look at the evidence base and what are the impacts that you're going to have in terms of the changes, but also look at how do you move towards more circular approach in terms of understanding the role of livestock and the environment, but also on the social and on the landscape itself. Now, what you've seen there in terms of the biodiversity, you can see that large percentage of the land globally, 25% of the world ecoregions have less than 1% intact, which means agriculture must spare the remnant forest, but also advance in terms of having net forest gains on the landscape to promote the conservation of biodiversity, but also with good practices that are involved in conserving the biodiversity and understanding biodiversity is a tool for provision of ecosystem services. Now, some of the slides I'm going to produce is not only related to the conventions of the climate change, but also cross-cutting with the biodiversity and what the UNCCD degradation desertification is promoting, because I think the environmental drivers are cutting across these conventions. And for this reason, we need a more systematic approach of how we look at livestock within the context of these conventions. Based on this report, you can see that tropical deforestation is very important, and especially as it relates, one of the drivers for deforestation is related to pasture expansion and beef production, especially in Amazon. 59% of this is related to what we've seen based on the data that is presented. And this has triggered an important debate in terms of the relationship between consuming countries, how do share the responsibility for emissions from deforestation. As you can see, Paraguay, Brazil, and to some extent Argentina, the exports that goes to the European Union, Middle East, China, and rest of Asia, etc. And this is triggering a debate on the trade policies that we need to promote in terms of what are the policies you need to do for bending the deforestation forest transition curve, a discussion that we had in the World Bank a few years ago. And now it is taking traction in terms of what are the policies do we need and what are the practices do we need to secure more sustainable practices while conserving the forests and biodiversity. So looking at the need for technologies, what are the trade and commercial agreements to provide incentives for sustainable practices? And what are the incentives to promote adoption of good practices, and also working with responsible consumers, which the global agenda has been also promoting. Recently, with the European Union, they have moved now new trade policies in terms of zero deforestation supply chains in the commodities, palm oil, soy, wood, cattle, cocoa, and coffee as some of the derived products that they've been working on. And these trade policies now are triggering changes in terms of the way policies are being set in terms of at the country and national and regional scale, but also advancing with the private sector in terms of looking at more responsible production, looking at certification schemes that would target on the zero deforestation. I still think we need to advance more in our knowledge to look at the linkages between deforestation and pasture. Most of the time, based on all the discussions that David Klimowitz made in terms of land speculation, etc., and also the relations with the narco and livestock, we have seen some changes in some areas like the Petén in Guatemala and some other places where there is this confounding effect in terms of deforestation related to pastures. On the other hand, CATIA's institution has been working with its partners to look at sustainable practices, looking at the landscape approach, as how can these silvopastoral or forest metrics, as well as sustainable feeding practices within the landscape can improve the biodiversity, conserve relatively good biodiversity within the landscapes, and there are good convincing data within several landscapes and agroecological conditions that we've been working on, which demonstrates that the intervention with good practices is advancing in the conservation of the species of interest for conservation, and looking at the gradient of different forest metrics, but also sustainable agriculture practices. What are these metrics that you need to use for promoting that? And here comes a discussion as what are the incentives that farmers going to have to promote the changes and transition towards these changes that they need from a monoculture pasture, degraded pasture systems into more sustainable practices, which I'm going to show some examples more in front. A few years ago with the FAO and the LEAD initiative, we worked on the payment for ecosystem services, which demonstrated that permanence of ecosystem service, more than 10 years that this project concluded, we made another assessment to see what were the impacts of the payment in terms of permanence. And we concluded that payment was an incentive for promoting the adoption of these technologies on farms. Farmers actually increased the ecosystem services points on the farms. And therefore, they are now the Costa Rican government, and to some extent, many of the regions are now working in terms of scaling up this knowledge at the national level. some problem. I have the slides. Okay, so the discussion that Henning mentioned about fire, you can see the global drought severity index here. And where this, you can see also in Australia, to some extent in Paraguay, and some other places where fire is a main problem and is related to the El Nino effect, but also the drought. But drought also has an impact in terms of the water availability, understanding that livestock depends on rain-fed for grass production, for the feed production. And therefore, this has severe impacts on what is happening in the livestock systems and the livelihoods of people. We have already seen evidence of recurrence in the whole of Central America and the dry corridor of Central America of the impacts that you're having with drought in these areas. The livestock and water footprint, that's something in discussion about how much water is being consumed in the livestock and how do you move towards more water efficiencies. That's an area that ILRI has been working on and has demonstrated that. Kati has also been working and looking at water efficiencies in livestock systems, but also translating that in policies on how do you promote more sustainable water management in these areas. Land degradation also has been a problem. Large percentage of pastures in Latin America are degraded with a potential recovery. This baseline information and the carbon stocks and soil organic matter, we have seen through regenerative pasture systems for sustainable production has promoted an increase in the carbon stocks and soil organic matter. And more recently, what ILRI has published in the Atlas for Land Degradation Neutrality of Rangelands, you can see the potential where these rangelands are increasing, improving in terms of the recovery and the states, as well as you can see that there are data that is promoting that the carbon and organic matter has been increasing in the rangelands through better grazing and management systems that has been promoted. So there are solutions, there are technologies and innovation, which research has been conducted with evidence of how this can be used for being part of the solutions to the problems of climate change. Now, the discussion about what are the emissions from the global carbon footprint for livestock. You have seen data which is varying from 11% up to 19.6%. I think there are differences in terms of the estimations. We need to have more precision to advance in the discussion. What are we accounting for? What are the precisions that we're using? What are, I think also you can see when UC Davis, there's a discussion about methane. Is it short-lived if there is overestimation? So therefore we need to understand better to give more trust in the data that we are developing and to convince on what are the status that we have in the area. For some reason, I have a problem. Te estoy teniendo problemas para avanzar en el slide. Okay. So Kati's been working on technologies, improvement of pastures, silvopastoral systems, looking at supplementation, understanding that we're working in dry areas to look at what are its impacts on reducing the emissions, looking at genetic improvement, having tropical breeds that are more adapted to the increasing temperatures and the stress that they're having. And we have good data which is showing that the baseline information in terms of emissions have been reduced, but also where productivity and production gains we're having from these innovations. There are similar examples in Uruguay and New Zealand and other countries where it's shown that there are good examples in terms of how we reduce the emissions while at the same time improving the productivity. I think there are good examples in terms of how do we reduce emission intensities, but the discussion here is the countries that have got their NDCs, what are the frontiers that they're working on to look at the net absolute reduction that you have in these emissions, which is a challenge for many of the countries. This slide is showing what Kati has been working on with its partners on the carbon footprint in different types of dairy farms. Understanding the agroecological conditions where livestock systems are very diverse in case of Central America and to some extent in Latin America. We have a lowland dual purpose cattle production systems where you're having a high emission per kilogram of meat or milk produced compared to what are the extensive dairy in the highlands, and what are the impacts on the soils and enteric fermentation, where you have differences also. Here, the issue here now from policymakers, where do you target these production systems, which to provide incentives and to be incorporated in the national strategies, for determination of reduction of emissions, which some countries are using now for implementing their policies and strategies for targeting these different systems. Some problems with the slides. ¿Usted puede ver qué pasa con la slide? I'm going to go from and go back into the slide set. This slide I borrowed from Henning, which has showed that the carbon sequestration, the potential, which has been argued from many researchers, of the importance of carbon sequestration in improved pastures as a way to advancing the carbon neutrality and offsetting the emissions. We have good data in terms of how carbon capture is. There's a discussion about where do you reach the equilibrium point. Carbon sequestration in the pastures are ranging from between 2 to 5 tons of carbon equivalents in many of the improved systems that we've seen. But the discussion here is how do we advance in argumenting that recovering these degraded pastures and transforming them into more productive, sustainable systems can be also part of the solutions for advancing in that. At Kathy's farm, we've also worked in terms of how do we look at the offsets in the soil, but also in the wood biomass of silvopastoral systems, reaching offsets of 28%, 26 to 28% of the emissions from milk in the milk farm. But also, if you include the soil carbon stored, we have an offset up to 60% if you look at the time scale that we're working on. So in synthesis, there are good data to show that the technologies are contributing towards reducing the emissions, but also enhancing the carbon sequestration in these areas. Sorry, I've had some problems with moving the slides. So, as I mentioned, in terms of the metrics, there are also discussions globally about what metrics we're using to measure the NDCs. Many of the countries now have got the livestock as part of the NDCs. You can see that some are with adaptation to climate change, some are for mitigation to climate change. So we have now look at Costa Rican data for enhancing the climate change NDCs. And Costa Rica is now planning for looking at reduction of the low carbon livestock strategy by 2030. 70% of the cattle herd and 60% of the land dedicated to livestock will be under low emissions in the production systems that they have. And the 2030 target is to reduce the emissions by 6 megatons of carbon, while reduction of the emissions from 30 to 45 kilograms per unit of agriculture GDP. Probably that Costa Rica has a plan for decarbonization. We have seen a similar plan in many of the countries in which they've got in the NDCs, and it's advancing. I think this is a good pilot to see where policies have been implemented and the agriculture sector working together with environmental sectors to advance on that. Uruguayan meat also has been advancing as an example, looking at traceability of all the cattle herd, where you're moving from innovation and technology into policy, reducing emissions through management, feeding and animal health, and carbon capture by afforestation. And here again, the Uruguayan meat production has been advancing in terms of how the country has moved on towards more transforming the food systems and with livestock as a base of that. Now I'm going to give an example from the Mitigation Action Facility. It used to be NAMA before, where Cathy now is working with MAF on a Honduran livestock sector to contribute to a low carbon economy, using the experiences, the innovation, the technologies that we've developed with the partners, and now moving to a national scale, for example. And this is working on looking at strengthening the extension services with a gender approach, but also looking at the financial instruments, which I think that looking at the finances and looking at the incentives and risk management is one of the areas that we need to work on to help farmers to look at risk factors and understanding how to channel an innovative credit scheme towards the farmers for investing in the green practices on the livestock farm. And at the same time, looking at the policy framework that we need to work on. Now, based on the projections of this project, you can see with the project with MAF, we're going to have significant reduction compared to the baseline information. With indirect mitigation, which you're going to have many farmers increasing in a cascade model that we have developed for the Honduras farmers and system. And over time, Honduras is going to be reporting in the NDCs of the reduction of the emissions from the livestock sector based on this program that we have started to implement in Honduras. This is a project that is going to be working over the next 5-10 years in the region. But also, I still think in terms of technologies, we need to have more data on the economics of it. What are the returns to the investments, but also which should guide us to see where do you need to provide incentives to promote more sustainable practices for biodiversity or for water, etc. So what we have done, and this using the Honduras MAF program example, looking at all the technological innovation in terms of live fences, silvopasture technologies, and the range of different innovations of technologies that you have for the farm based on my participatory approaches. What are the return to investments? What are the reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases? And what are the impacts on the carbon sequestration and the impacts on biodiversity? And here we can see that the marginal abatement curve, which we have done also, has shown that there's some returns on practices that are more enhancing biodiversity will need incentives, as I've mentioned before, as for example, payment for carbon or payment for ecosystem services like biodiversity. And for this reason, we need to advance on the policy makers to look at how you differentiate the policies for investing in these technologies for having these advancements.
Dr. Ibrahim, you have 30 seconds left if you want to reach some conclusions. Thank you.
So I just want to say that, you know, there has been an advance on what the discussion about alternative meat. You can see that the Jude has been working on emission hotspots, looking at plant-based ice cream, for example, with they're showing low emissions, reduce ingredients, reduce area that they're working on, to look at what the discussion is moving on the alternatives for beef and milk. But what I need to bring this to your attention for the discussion to say where livestock is going to be part of the solution and an integral approach of all these discussions. But also, I would like to take 1 minute more of my time, please. Recently, Bruce Campbell was in Cathy and he made this presentation, and I took the slide because I think it's very important to share with you on the misinformation and livestock sector for ministries in export-oriented countries. This is what was mentioned in the slide. Lambin is climate neutral. This is research was funded in part by meat and milk livestock. Cattle industry has led the effort to conserve native grasslands and help maintain one of Canada's natural carbon sinks. Denmark protein is a problem, so the Danish livestock farmers are very important, very efficient in terms of greenhouse per kilogram of output. Uruguay positions on livestock farming as a potentially carbon neutral activity, one in which emissions are offset by carbon storage in the soils of the pastures. and the Irish Creamery Milk Suppliers Association reducing the production of food in Ireland, last resort for the country's growing population. And the next, plant-based diets can reduce emissions by up to 50% compared to the average emission in intensive West diet. So based on those slides, I've put some recommendations. I think we need a better understanding of the trade-offs and synergies between sustainable climate-smart practices with the socioeconomic benefits. How will rangeland landscape appear if livestock farming is not part of the livelihoods of people? Transformational changes, moving from resort to commercial scale. What are the proxies for evaluating gains in biodiversity, reduction of emissions, water efficiencies, etc.? Understanding behavioral responses, for example, how farmers are responding to policies of the New Zealand government, for example, in New Zealand government to reduce emissions from the livestock sector, what are incentives and what are the risk aversion factors? In climate and environmental finance, we need to move beyond pledges from the private sector towards operationalization, the implementation, incentives and risk management. And these three recommendations was on the emphasis on mitigation, but I still think that we need to move more work on adaptation, looking at the resiliencies and the synergies between mitigation and adaptation, and metrics for monitoring adaptation to climate change and improve metrics for mitigation. And finally, a holistic approach to evaluate competing claims of alternatives to livestock-based commodities. My apologies for the problems for the slides. Sometimes the technology doesn't work, and sorry for the overtime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, for your insight. It has indeed been very interesting. I would like to remind everyone that our Slido is open right now for comments on which other environmental drivers are affecting either positively or negatively the livestock sector. And we appreciate your comments through the platform. Now, our expert panelists are ready to share their insights on solutions to address these environmental challenges. Each panelist will be speaking for about 10 minutes, and then we will interact with them through questions and interventions from the audience. I will introduce the first of our panelists, Mr. Pierre Gerber. He is Senior Livestock Specialist at the World Bank. He is a PhD from ETH Zurich, Switzerland, and Senior Livestock Specialist at the World Bank, and he leads investment and analytical activities across the livestock portfolio. Mr. Gerber, I will give you the floor for the next 10 minutes, and I will be letting you know when you have 5 minutes left. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in this event, in this seminar, to see people I used to work with some years back, and it's great to see you all. You asked a few questions, guiding questions, and I thought the best way to address them in the short time we have is to place them in the context of the country where I'm working in now, which is Uzbekistan, located in Central Asia. So, in a few words, Uzbekistan is a country where climate, water constraints are known since a long time. To the left here, you see a map of the country, and in green, you see the irrigated areas, 4 million hectares. And it's pretty much what the country has been living on in terms of agriculture. Rainfall have always been very low. And doing that, the country benefited from very important ecosystem services. And that is the fact that to the east of the country, Tajikistan and others, you have vast glaciers. And these glaciers retain the water during the winter. Can you go up one slide? Retain the water when the irrigation don't need any water, and release it during the summer when crops, fodder, and other need water for irrigation. And these ecosystem services are now being affected dramatically by climate change, of course, which affects the rainfall pattern, the snowing on these glaciers, and of course, the size and the melting of these glaciers. To the end, to the lower level, here you see that we are projecting severe shortages of water in irrigation systems. And this is affecting, of course, crops and livestock feed. In the non-irrigated area, you find pastoralism, which is also suffering from climate change. So what is kind of this big driver, stressor to the sector. Through climate change, we see water availability that affects feeds and animals themselves, temperature that affects yield of feed, and also yield of animal themselves, and the capacity to tap into breeds that have high productivity. Disease and pests that are moving, emerging, changing their distribution with climate change that affects feed and animals also. Importantly, also cost of input. The country imports some feed, and that is affected by climate change. And labor productivity. When temperatures go into the 45, 50 degrees Celsius, it affects labor productivity. Diseases also do affect labor productivity. So it's the harshness of the environment and the climate is not new, but these trends, in terms of rainfall and temperature, are definitely going to accelerate the impact on the sector. Next slide. So I'll put those two next question also in the context of Uzbekistan. Next slide. Yeah, so this is where we are working. We have an ongoing portfolio in Uzbekistan of 1.5 billion and livestock operation just starting of 250 million US dollars. Just succinctly describe where we're working. Pasture management and land restoration, knowing that there is actually little capacity given what I just described in terms of rainfall pattern in the country. Important because most of the animals are housed and living basically on these crop residues, cultivated fodder and so on, so they are managed. There is potential to improve manure management, to work in the direction of circularity, and to really make full use of the byproducts, if you want, from the animal production. We also work on diets. It's a country where consumption levels are not necessarily very high. We are at 45 kilograms of meat per capita per year. So compared to Europe, Latin America, North America, it's less than half. But there is clearly, as the population becomes more affluent, a tendency to increase the meat portions and to increase meat consumption. So there is a need to look at slowing down somehow some of those trends to make sure that behind the consumer we have still a range of options in terms of production systems. Definitely resource use efficiency, especially with water, but also with the feed that depends heavily on the water, is very important. So here you have all the space of digitalization and technology innovation to improve resource use efficiency. And there is great scope given the solar insulation of the country to work on renewable. It's also a country where we use oil and coal and gas to produce electricity. So if we can cut down electricity consumption in the systems, either by being more efficient or substituting, then we are also able to reduce the emissions and also to get off the grid and supply with those technology populations that are not necessarily served by the grid. So how do we do that? Next click, please. Yeah. How do we do that, right? Because that's the question. How do you make sure that the practices, technologies, and so on are changing in those various areas that I just described? So one important way is through access to finance and make access to finance conditional to certain practices, to certain indicators that will move the sector in certain directions, right? So the conditionality of access to finance is a strong instrument there. So you make low competitive grants, concessional grants to producers, conditional to certain things that is moving the sector in the right direction. We work closely with the ministry on legislation. Obviously, that's the other area to have economy-wide impact. We are also working on sectoral strategies and national commitments, especially in the area of climate change. So making sure that what is done in the livestock sector is connected to national commitments So the link is made between those at the Prime Minister office or the Ministry of Environment who are making certain commitments and those working in the sector, in the veterinary committee or so on, to work on those topics. We of course support extension services, and we have also a module on research. Next slide. Importantly, and Mohammed, you mentioned that also in your presentation, with the change of the ecosystems and other changes such as transport, movements of people, etc., are emerging new pathogens or are emerging pathogens that are becoming resilient to the medicines we have. And so there is kind of this feedback also through that level, so through that mechanism on the livestock sector, because this affects productivity, this affects capacity to trade, this affects the safety of the products and the consumer, etc. So we have a large program going on One Health, which is obviously linking human health, ecosystem health, and livestock in the region, and dialogue that is very strong now in the region and which should lead to some interesting projects. Next slide. So finally, as to share some key messages, so they are a little broader than what we are doing in Uzbekistan, and by the way, you see how beautiful this country here is to the left. So I think one important thing is to help convert high-level commitments to sustainability or to other MDGs into practical action. Right? Typically, you have those commitments made by certain parts of the administration, and then you are not necessarily able to transmit that to those in the administration who are able to really foster the changes. And to do that, and so it's a little bit disconnected if you want. So you need to build confidence, propose analysis, propose options, provide technical assistance. So you help basically translating those high-level commitments into practical action and to what can be done on the ground. The important is, next point I want to highlight is the need to bring convergence between the various triggers of change. I listed them in that yellow box before. They have to work together. What you do on legislation, what you could do on finance, what you could do on research and extension, this has to work together and converge towards the practice change, technology adoption, or the support to innovation, the direction of innovation that you're looking for. 3, build evidence. Measure progress as you go. So measure progress on addressing these environmental drivers that you mentioned, and therefore and spend enough resources, enough attention to measure progress, so you build the confidence that I was also mentioning on the first point. So that kind of reinforcement of this confidence. And the last point, very important and well known, I think, around this table, is to take advantage of the diversity of livestock systems. Here, as in other places, we have rangelands, we have intensified operation, we have traditional crop system, mixed crop livestock system. They all have a role to play, and among different populations, for different consumers, different commodities. And it is really important to make sure they are all at the table and they all come into the capacity of the sector to address these drivers and respond to the demand. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerber, for your presentation. I will now give the floor to Ms. Aditi Mukherjee for the next 10 minutes. Ms. Mukherjee is Climate Change Adaptation and Mitigation Impact Action Platform of the CGIAR. Ms. Mukherjee is a human geographer by training and has a PhD from Cambridge University as a Gates Cambridge Scholar. Her areas of specialization are groundwater governance, energy irrigation nexus, climate change adaptation, and community management of water resources. She has worked in South Asia, including the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, the Nile Basin, and in Central Asia. Thank you very much, Ms. Mukherjee. I will give you 10 minutes and I will let you know when your time is advancing through the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariel, and thanks to the organizers and particularly Shirley for getting me involved in this, as the readout of my bio confirmed that I am not a livestock person. I think my link to this webinar is my background in climate change somewhat. And so basically I have been in the last hour or so been learning a lot from all of you. So there are actually two links. First is that I am the director of the climate change platform of the CGIAR, and in that role, we are writing this year the breakthrough report commissioned by the FCDO, but this is something that's launched at COP28, and livestock mitigation from the livestock sector is an important chapter in that, which has been written by my colleagues from ILRI. The second link is, as from 1st of September, I'm also based at the ILRI campus here in Nairobi. So hello, everybody from Nairobi. I do not have a presentation, but what I do have are some of the responses to the 4 questions that have been posed to all the panelists. The first question is, how do environmental stressors associated to climate change are affecting livestock farming? While our previous speakers and panelists have talked about a whole range of environmental stressors, the one that I want to stress today more than others is something to do with the heat. I have been also involved as a coordinating lead author and a co-writing team author of the IPCC assessment report that just concluded in March this year. And one of the things that I think most of you are aware of the IPCC's reports that have been coming over in the AR6 cycle over the last couple of years. But one of the things that's come out is very, very important is the fact that there is with high confidence, almost certainty, that heat stress and extreme temperature events have increased globally everywhere. Almost no continent, nowhere is kind of, exempt from that high heat stress. And what it does to cattle is something really, really something to be really concerned about. And this is a latest paper that has been published just a couple of days back, I presume, in the Environmental Research Letter. In this paper, what they are doing is they are looking at what is the threshold at which negative impacts on cattle starts affecting cattle productivity, including milk production. And they find that it is something like a temperature and humidity index of 68.8%. That's the index, not a percentage, 68.8. So basically, that's an index of both temperature and humidity, because the other thing that has happened with climate change is also that there is more humidity and more extreme rainfall events also. So with that, and that's kind of that 68.8 temperature humidity index is where negative impacts start. And the matter of concern is that currently almost 80% of the cattle already are exposed to such conditions for at least 30 days a year. Majority of those are actually in the tropical areas. These are areas like here in Africa and in large parts of other places with these high hot temperatures. Now, if the global warming were to go above 4 degrees, I mean, thankfully, though the current trajectories are showing that we will not possibly go over 4 degrees, we are now more slated towards 2.9 to 3.1 degree, given all the NDC commitments. Finger crossed that those commitments actually turn into action. Even then, it shows that if 4 degree were to be reached by the end of the century, heat stress would be around 180 days per year, which would be basically debilitating condition for most of the cattle. And these projections show that by 2100, a billion cattle population would be under heat stress. And that has obviously huge amount of negative implications on the health of the cattle and all the other aspects that my previous speakers have talked about. Very closely linked to heat stress is also the issue of drought, which I will not go into, which has been really covered very well by previous speakers. And there's a whole lot of literature that talks about how these extreme weather events are affecting livestock population. Now, if I might go to the next question that was asked to us about how can implementation of technology innovations, and please stop me if this is not the correct forum, because what I'm planning to do is to go through those 4 questions in brief within my 10 minutes. So the next question was like, how can implementation of technology innovations aimed at processing excreta to be reused as source of renewable energy could contribute to making livestock farming more sustainable? I think that's an excellent question. And again, I'm drawing on from the breakthrough report, which will be released by the middle of this month, 15 September. It's by the IEA, the International Energy, IEA, International Energy Agency, and a few others. Of which CGIAR is writing the agriculture chapter. So here we are actually talking about a lot about anaerobic digester or biogas digesters, and how they are actually a very good climate mitigation strategy, because what they are doing is not only reducing methane emissions, but they are also capturing that methane and substituting that as fossil fuel. That's one. And then the slurry is also used as a fertilizer. So they are also then replacing chemical fertilizer. So anaerobic digesters or biogas digesters are one of those really good climate solution. This is one of those places where the technology is there, in every possible scale, micro scale, meso scale, industrial scale, large scale, you talk about it, and there is, and the potential is huge. I mean, the numbers are actually quite mind-boggling. So basically, if all collectible manure was to be utilized through this technology, it could produce up to 10 billion tons of nutrient-rich fertilizer and capture enough methane to generate around mind-boggling amounts, like around 3,000 or more terawatt hours of energy. So these are big numbers, which comes from credible sources. But the issue here is not so much of the technology, but about the enabling institutions and the finance and the rest of it, that I think previous speakers have talked about it. So it's really about more than technology. In that sphere, there are some successful examples, such as the biogas digesters in East Africa. That was a long-ranging project. I'm sure many of you listening here have been involved with perhaps. This was active from 2009 to 2020, initiated by the Dutch government. And this has installed over 73,000 biodigesters in all around East Africa, particularly Kenya, with lots of good advantages, including CO2 emission reduction. So we do have those kind of technologies available. What's required is more finance and hand-holding support. Then number 3 question was 2-3 examples of management practices aimed at minimizing negative impacts of extreme climate events. I think I will not go much into detail, because the previous speaker talked a lot around climate smart livestock practices as well as silvopastoral systems. So those are, I mean, the thing about livestock sector is that a lot of what the mitigation measures also have a lot of adaptation co-benefits. A lot of the adaptation measures also have mitigation co-benefits, things like feed storage and forage management, as well as proper management of pasture, grasslands, and grazing management, etc. The final question that was posed to me was, what was the key messages? And this is where I think I want to speak more frankly, and not based on the reports and papers that I was quoting here, but more as wearing my IPCC scientist hat and having worked with this issue for the last so many years, is that we all know climate change is a matter of physics. On the one hand, it is really excessive greenhouse gas emissions that is warming up the planet. But it is also about, fairness, justice, and equity. It's not just enough that GHGs have been emitted, but we have to be very conscious and understand who emitted, how, and where. And I mean, to put it very bluntly, that lot of the mess that we are seeing it in terms of the climate change has been created by the rich in the high-income countries largely. And it is the poor, and it is those pastoral livestock farmers in some of the poorest countries in the world whose current and future choices are getting limited. So it may be physics, but it is also a lot around equity and justice. And nowhere do we see this. Livestock is a prime example. Here, according to data by FAO, and I know one of my speakers mentioned it earlier in the context of Uzbekistan, here, according to the FAO data, we see that meat consumption really varies a lot. We have countries consuming, up to 120 kilograms in some countries in the global north, while it is as low as 10 kilograms in some countries in Africa. We know meat, and particularly meat produced in the kind of industrial agriculture, is also a major source of emissions. So here the solution is to eat meat more responsibly, more sustainably, especially where it is eaten way more than it even has health benefits to it. So to sum up for me, as somebody who is quite new to the livestock area, livestock story is really a story of the huge disparities in consumption between the global north and the global south, and is also a story of how climate injustice is getting perpetuated on some of the people whose prime livelihood comes from livestock. And this is where I think a lot of our future efforts needs to go into, in teasing out that we through future policies actually ameliorate the climate injustice, and responsible consumption, particularly among the rich and the global north, is one way to go about it. I will stop there and thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mukherjee, and thank you for your insights. We will continue discussing the questions you posed in the next section. But now I'm going to give the floor to Mr. Juan Jaramillo from Technical Support Unit Mitigation Action Facility. He is advisor at the Technical Support Unit at the Mitigation Action Facility with a Master in Science in Environmental Governance. Mr. Jaramillo, if you would like, you can present your screen. You will be able to have 10 minutes for your presentation. And I will let you know through the chat how your time is advancing. Thank you. You have the floor now.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can see me now. It appears that my camera is not working properly at the moment. I want to thank everyone for the invitation, of course, today. And I actually want to provide a little bit of a different approach to the conversation that we have had today. So we have seen several examples of technology innovations that could actually contribute to the improvement of the livestock sector across the world. And what I want to add today is that actually to facilitate the implementation of this, or the actually uptake of these different technologies, funding is required. And we at the Mitigation Action Facility actually are providing funding for the implementation of those initiatives. So what is the Mitigation Action Facility? We are a multi-donor fund from the German, British and Danish government.
Excuse me, Mr. Jaramillo, sorry for interrupting, but we cannot see you. I don't know if you can check your camera.
Give me a second, please.
Yes.
I will try to solve the issue.
And also, if you can put your presentation in your PowerPoint in presentation mode.
I cannot hear you at the moment. If you were to give me a second.
Of course.
I hope that you can still hear me well.
No, we can't. I can see only an image, but I can't see you.
Okay, give me a second.
But don't worry, if we can continue and we can read your
It's
presentation.
working better.
No worries, we can continue as it is if your
Okay,
camera
great.
is not working.
Well, apologies for that. So as I was saying, we in the Mitigation Action Facility were a multi-donor fund from the German, British and Danish government, but also from the European Union and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. And this year we just had our 10-year anniversary, which gave us the opportunity to update ourselves, including our mission and value proposition, which is or seek to accelerate the decarbonization to keep temperature rising below 1.5 degrees. And we want to do this by financing measures that shift priority sectors in the partner countries towards a sustainable carbon neutral pathway. To achieve that, we act as an agile, high impact and country-driven fund that supports scalable and replicable sector-wide solutions including pilots for novel technologies that our partner countries are looking to integrate to meet their climate goals. So what we do in Mitigation Action Facility is to fund transformational climate mitigation projects that contribute to reducing global warming gases emissions. And we also identify these projects through annual calls. In this case, our latest call closed earlier this year and was open for the sectors of transport, energy, and industry, as well as cross-sectoral initiatives. If you were not aware of it, I will invite you to go to our website and maybe inform yourself in the case for future calls. But we also have to strengthen our partners' countries' capacity through diverse set of technical and financial instruments that can create these scalable and replicable projects, both at national and regional levels. And last but not least, we act as a knowledge hub, where learnings from all the projects that have implemented are gathered and shared to encourage more ambitious climate actions across a different set of institutions and countries that are working with us. Up until last year, we have selected 47 projects for implementation and committed to them more than 668 million euros. This funding has leveraged over 1.6 billion euros, for which our local partners have provided additional funds to support implementation of the project and introduction of the technologies that they were aiming at. So one of those projects is actually being implemented by our colleagues in CATI, and was earlier referenced by Mr. Ibrahim as one of the flagship projects that we have in the livestock sector. This project recently started working on the transformation of the livestock sector in Honduras, and it is aiming at transforming 1,500 farms into low-carbon production systems by improving the productivity, the profitability, and the climate resilience of the farms, while also maximizing the carbon sequestration potential that they have. This project has 4 main axes of work that cover the enhancement of existing extension programs, the improvement of access to climate finance, fostering the knowledge of low-carbon solutions, and the alignment of efforts within the regulatory framework for livestock in Honduras. As I know that I'm already kind of running out of time, I just want to offer you, before I close my intervention, I would like to highlight that the pressure that climate change continues to put on these key natural resources for the livestock sector remain very important. And it is equally important how this has only increased the need for the adoption of technologies and practices that can increase the efficiency and the sustainability of the livestock production, which can only be achieved at the same time if financing to these activities is redirected. And of course, with those funds, it will be expected that the improvement of these improved technologies and practices will be implemented on time. And that will be the last message that I would like to share with you. I apologize for the technical inconvenience. If you were to be interested in knowing more about the mitigation action facilities, you can find my contact details here. I really apologize again for the issues and welcome any further exchange during the course of the webinar later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaramillo, for your insightful presentation. And again, thank you to all the panelists for your insights. For the next section, we're going to start a discussion with the panelists and the questions that were posed. Before we continue, I would like to thank the people who have just joined our session. Just in case you need translation, we have that available. And we also want to thank the people who are joining us through our social media, both through our Facebook account and our YouTube account. Indeed, this will be recorded and available for consultation later through those accounts. For now, we also want to share what we have been receiving through Slido. As you remember, we had posted a question on what are those negative and positive elements for this, and we have received several answers, as you can see, of which are the environmental drivers that are affecting the livestock sector. As you can see, some are related to conservation of natural forests, landscape preservation, climate change again, which is recurring through the conversation, deforestation and forestation. And also we have had some comments in the chat which are mentioning also the importance of responsible consumption and the equity issue. Thank you very much for all of those who have been participating. And we will now continue to a more interactive section of our webinar today. For this section, we are joined by Mr. Danilo Peso, who is lecturer and consultant on livestock and environmental management at CATIE, Costa Rica, and co-editor of Tropical Grassland Journals, who will be joining us in analyzing the key elements for this session. To the panelists, we would appreciate your observations on the questions that were posed at the beginning, but I will read them again for our guests. The three questions that were posed were: how do environmental stressors associated to climate change affect livestock farming? The second question is on how can the implementation of technological innovations aimed at processing excreted to be reused as a source of renewable energy could contribute making livestock farming more sustainable in the context of climate change? And the last question is, what key messages would you like to convey to the participants about the importance of collectively addressing climate change and innovation in livestock farming? I will now give the floor to our expert, Mr. Peso, who will discuss more openly with our panelists on these three questions. Mr. Peso,
thank you, Mariel. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm really very glad to be participating in this webinars, and I declare I have learned a lot of the presentations of the key speakers and the discussions or panelists have made. We are open to receive questions from the floor, but just to start, I will give one question to all the panelists and the presenters. As a person who have been involved in research and education for many years, I wonder if you have some suggestions on how can these topics will become part of the curricula at the university and postgraduate level, but also on the extension programs that the countries have. If we want to have these changes done, I think we need to change the education of people, either the professionals, technicians, and farmers. Then if you have some comments on that, I will appreciate your reactions. It is open to any one of the panelists or the key speakers if you want.
Thank you, Mr. Peso. Any of the panelists would like to take the floor? In the meantime, I would like to remind also those in our webinar that you can now access our third question. And the idea is, as you hear the responses from the panelists in these questions, and the important question Mr. Peso presented now is we want to brainstorm on some solutions, and you can answer your questions through the Slido. Any of the panelists want to take the floor? Mr. Gerber, Ms. Mukherjee, Mr. Jaramillo. Go ahead, Ms. Mukherjee. Yes.
Yeah, so sorry, yeah. I think role of education and research remains critical as ever. For me, one of the things that I highlighted a little bit was I do not think everybody understands climate change. Again, I'm coming more from a climate change perspective. So there is a lot of media coverage about climate change and people know kind of why climate change is happening. But I think the link between individual choices and climate change is often not clear. I mean, at some level, there may be a failure, but there's also, we know, a lot of vested interests. So some of the, I think the previous speaker, Dr. Mohammed, showed all those kind of, remarks as in climate misinformation happening. So I think education in terms of understanding the links between individual behavior, and here I'm really talking about consumption behavior, looking inwards and thinking about how our consumption, how our lifestyle is affecting, and then kind of having more empathy and putting ourselves in the shoes of the ones who are really impacted by climate change, in the forefront of climate change. And those are our smallholder producers, our pastoralists, and our smallholder farmers and women farmers in some of the most marginalized places. I think that's what the education needs to be, not more around technical education about how to make a biodigester. We have that, I think. What we need is education needs to make those linkages clear, make it more intuitive, to make us look inwards and to examine our choices and how that affects others less, in a less privileged position. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. Yeah, I agree with you, but the point is also when we check or we review the curricula at the university level, I wonder if these topics are really properly addressed in the education programs. That was another point. Recently, I made a review of programs in animal production for Latin America, and I found that in the programs, these topics are very, very rarely covered. Okay. I wonder if we have some question of somebody wants to raise a question. Just please raise your hand or use this raise hand symbol. Then we can give you or Mariel can give you the word.
Thank you very much. We do have indeed a few questions and comments in the chat. We have here a comment specifically regarding the education in the agrarian system and the importance of including that. We have comments here. We actually have a question that we received through the Slido, which we would like to post also to the panelists, which poses, kindly provide us only one idea, as hard as this might be, on a possible pathway for improving the current livestock production systems, considering the environmental drivers that affect those. Your suggestions would be considered for building collective action. That is the question that we have been posed. So perhaps if we can brainstorm one concept, I will leave that for either Pierre or Aditi or Juan, if you want to comment on this. In the meantime, I see we have here some comments. Rogerio is commenting exactly on education in the agrarian system in the tropics, still follows the principles of green revolution, mainly in Brazil. He says that we have built these systems, including agroecology, as a basis for facing climate change. We have some questions here. We have a comment. UC Davis has programming on sustainable livestock production in their program, undergraduate animal science program. That is very good, the program that is included at UC Davis. Let's see, we have here Mr. Peso, perhaps if you would like to comment maybe on the question that was posed on one idea for the pathway for improving the current livestock. the production system in general. You're on mute. I'm sorry if you can unmute your.
I think Pierre Gerber wants to take the word. Yeah.
Of course, Mr. Gerber.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really would not want to cite one pathway, and I think that's also a good link to the previous question. That is where we need education. That's where we need people who know both the systems, so where we can make changes in the systems, how we can trigger changes in the systems, and know what is outside the systems, right? What we are doing livestock for, right? And can connect, therefore, the sector to these broader development objectives. And so I don't think, it makes, really, one pathway, mentioning one pathway is really the thing here. But again, having people around the decision maker who are able to convert the broad level commitments to the actions in the sector, to the transformation of the sector, is where we really need a push. I mean, I can speak for a lot of the World Bank livestock portfolio and say that we are generally speaking short of knowledge people on teams, whether it is supporting the bank or on the side of the client, who are able to articulate those issues and who are able to design pathways that are adapted to the various systems. So yeah, a big push for education on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerber. We also have been receiving some other comments. I think this question, and perhaps one of the panelists can comment specifically for farmers. And this person is commenting that it's very important to be participant and act as an actor in the large programming area where there are farms. He mentions that in France, they use a low carbon farm program as well, perhaps linking to the comment that Aditi mentioned on small farmers, right, and how they can be included into a larger action plan as well. We have some other comments here in the chat, and I would like, of course, to remind everyone that this is going to be available for consulting later, as this is being recorded. Let's see here. We have some comments mentioning the importance of the discussion regarding livestock productions include contribution to climate change. The difference between pastoralism and intensive industrial livestock systems should be made clear. Thank you very much for your comment, Yolda Initiative. Let's see. I perhaps would like to come back to the question we posed at the beginning on those key messages. Aditi had mentioned previously what are some of the key messages, and you were talking about equity on access. What would you perhaps, if you would like to extend your comment on what are those key messages you would like to convey to the participants about the importance of collectively addressing climate change and the innovation in livestock farming? We also have some other questions. Guillermo is mentioning that indeed there is a need to reformulate the study plans. It is important to incorporate the local knowledge of native peoples regarding problems such as climate change, agroforestry, agroecology. Thank you very much for your comment, Guillermo. Okay, perhaps we will check also what answers we have been receiving through the Slido. There, the panelists will also be able to see what the general comments are on this topic. As you can see, we have several comments here. This person is thinking too much as one of the pathways, thinking too much to natural resources dynamics in developing future livestock systems, which mean variable diets and variable productivity along seasons and years. We have another comment of someone indicating that we cannot disassociate environmental drivers from social ones and other drivers. And I think they're all interlinked. That is very insightful. It is clear that locally adapted systems are better suited to withstand climate change. So we must ensure that these systems survive. We have another comment here that recognizing the diversity of livestock systems and avoiding generalization of finding specifics to certain livestock systems and geographies. That is very important. We have other comments here, several ones on soil regeneration capacity, which is indeed some of the ideas of a pathway for improving the livestock production systems. Perhaps I would like to know if any of the other panelists would like to comment on the participation of our attendees through the Slido. Yes, indeed, here Anthropune mentions the curriculum on animal science, veterinary sciences needs to be reviewed. Social considerations, including gender, need to be carefully considered while designing the curriculum. And indeed, I think there have been a lot of comments on the education section and curriculum section that must be intersectional, no? On several aspects to be considered here. Okay. If someone has any other specific questions, you can also include them in the chat. Okay. Well, for now, I don't see any more specific questions. Perhaps if one of the panelists would like to give some concluding words for this first session before we go on our break. Either to Mr. Gerber, Mr. Jaramillo, or Ms. Mukherjee.
Yeah, maybe just something that maybe we didn't talk too much about. I mean, I think that the sector has always responded to drivers, right? And the livestock systems have adapted and transformed and morphed in reaction and in the context of those drivers. And today we're looking at environment, and in the next seminars we look at others. I think what is clear is that those drivers are, from the environment side, are becoming stronger and stronger, but also more unpredictable, right? And changing direction, changing amplitude faster and faster. So the whole equipment that we have to get the signal of these drivers and pass it over to those who are making decisions in the livestock systems to to cope with those drivers need to adapt. And certainly we are not yet there. So there, I think there is a whole body of work on awareness systems, on information system, weather and climate systems. But there is a lot to invest there, I think. In providing, in developing the tools and then providing the information systems that transfer these signals from the drivers fast enough, maybe early enough, to those who make decisions on the system and can adapt. So maybe that's something that didn't really come up in the conversation, which I think is important to notice in that context of looking at the drivers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gerber. Mr. Jaramillo or Ms. Mukherjee, some concluding words?
Yeah, nothing much really to add per se, except that, as I said, it's important to keep moving forward when we look at the justice. And I saw some comments saying efficiency and versus resilience. I think while it's good to make systems more efficient, but it's not about that. It's also about improving resilience and providing the right incentives to do the right thing in terms of consumption, and also being very careful about many of the technologies that we might have are good enough to reduce mitigation, but how are they still helping smallholder farmers? We at the CGIAR, for instance, that's our core clientele, smallholder producers and farmers. So I think and those are the most exposed to climate change. So how do we make sure that the solutions work for those pastoral and smallholder farmers is, I think, something that I would reiterate, having said that already. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mukherjee. And I will now give the floor to Mr. Jaramillo for some concluding words.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention that it is really important not only to articulate the knowledge that it already exists and that need to be bring back to the actual smallholder farmers across the world, because they are the ones that will actually put these things to action. But there is also the need to articulate the efforts also in regards to those being made by the policymakers and decision makers at different governmental positions that could help redirect those incentives that exist to, let's say, outdated or not fully in line with the goals of climate change mitigation and the resilience that is being sought for the livestock sector across the world. And I think that that gap is still one of the main issues that remain in the sector, and that of course can be seen not only in livestock but also across different productive sectors in the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jaramillo. And perhaps I would like just to give the floor to Mr. Peso for some just some concluding words before we go to our break.
Thank you, Mariel, and thank you for all who have made comments and suggestions and questions to the to the panelists. I think there are some very many things are very clear. First of all, I think one of the points that has been raised in these presentations is that we have to consider the diversity of livestock systems that we have and how those adjust to the different agroecosystem conditions that we have in the world. The second thing is that this is not only the effort of one institution or one person. It's a collective effort that we need to meet what GASL is promoting. And I think webinars like this and other activities that are planned for the following weeks are very important as a way of collecting the position, the ideas, the contributions of the many participants. That is my general synthesis of what we have seen in here. And the other thing is probably there was a comment on that is not only environmental aspect, but also the social aspects. And I think it is very important to keep this in mind. But I think if we see the program of the 3 webinars, you will see that all these topics are being covered along the 3 webinars. This is all what I have, and thank you very much, Mariel, and thank you for all who are participating in this webinar, for their contributions through Slido, through the comments that you wrote, and the comments that made orally some of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peso. And I would also join in thanking everyone who has participated. Of course, the panelists, our keynote speakers, for your insights, but also our participants who have been quite active on both platforms through the chat and through the Slido. And these interactions are essential in identifying what are the ways forward. Now, I would like to take a brief pause. We will recharge before proceeding to the next topic. We will take a 10-minute break. We would remind everyone that we will continue in the next session on the section on technological innovation drivers. We will reconvene in 10 minutes, so we would appreciate you staying connected with us and participating in the next session. So we will see each other again in 10 minutes. See you soon. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Just to let you know that we will be resuming our webinar. Just making sure everyone had a nice break, got some water, and we will now continue with our next section on innovation technological drivers. Okay, I think we are all back now. And remember that we have the Slido session open where we have been receiving some impressions on drivers and solutions. And please feel free to keep on commenting as we move on to our next panel. Okay, now we will continue with our next panel. Each person will be presenting for 15 minutes. Joining us, we have Mr. Daniel Mason DeCross, Senior Research Associate at Cornell Global Development at Cornell University. And we also have Alison Van Enenman from the Department of Animal Science, University of California, which will highlight solutions related to innovation technological drivers. They'll discuss how these advancements are reshaping livestock practices, and as well recall that through our Slido, the question that we have for the next session is summarize in a single word the most influential technological driver affecting livestock systems. And of course, as we did before, we will review your answers at that time. Okay, so now we will start with the presentation of Mr. Daniel Mason DeCross. If you would like, you can share your screen and turn on your camera. Just making sure that you hear me. Okay, perfect. You now have
see that all right?
Yes, perfect. You now have the floor for 15 minutes, and I will let you know how your time goes in the chat.
Very good. All right, well, so I prepared a few slides here to just give a little bit of, I guess, a broad view of the potential role of agri-food system innovations, technologies, and changes, and how these could present both challenges and opportunities to sustainable livestock systems into the future. As Marielle already introduced, I'm Daniel Mason DeCross. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Cornell Food Systems and Global Change inside the Department of Global Development. I'm a political and development economist by background, so not a livestock expert, a little bit like Aditi. I work on these topics more as a part of a broader research questions of food systems and sustainable outcomes, mostly with a focus on food security questions and of the role of innovation, technology, and climate change. A few things I think that are worth considering as we start off is a little bit of the context here in terms of what we're looking at. We're looking at a global population that is, depending on the projection, ranging from somewhere in a little bit below 10 billion to a little bit over 10 billion by the end of the century. And with suggestions that if current demand trends continue with this growing population, that we might be needing to look at anywhere from about a third to almost 2/3 more agricultural production by 2050. This is taking into account that, at least in terms of looking at it from a health perspective, that globally we're already consuming more than is probably good for our own health, and certainly putting pressure on the environment. The global number itself obviously can mask a lot of heterogeneity across the world, with many regions, including in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, actually eating below recommended consumption levels, whereas in high-income countries, particularly in Europe, North America, Oceania, Australia, can be consuming substantially above recommended levels. But having said that, it's also worth recognizing that while meat demand is projected to continue growing into the future, in most countries on a per capita basis, beef and small ruminant demand has not really changed much since 1990 levels. Now, this might be in part because of preferences or in terms of sort of different price trajectories as the production of pork and poultry have grown so dramatically in terms of their efficiency and driven down prices, particularly compared to beef. In terms of the consequence of this, as I mentioned, current diets are already one of the biggest causes of non-communicable diseases, and a shift to more plant-based diets could both ease environmental pressures and contribute to improved health outcomes. And the reason that it's important to recognize the role of demand is that while increasing livestock productivity is a very important outcome and something that we need to be striving towards, on its own, it's not going to be sufficient towards assuring a more sustainable agri-food system. Increasing productivity can lead to Jevons paradox, where it can reduce prices and spur on demand. And in terms at least for emissions from livestock, the biggest driver of emissions is actually animal numbers. So we need to have a way of both meeting demand while reducing animal numbers and emissions, and just increasing productivity, at least in a very narrow sense of meat or milk production per animal, isn't necessarily going to help us reduce overall emissions. It might help with reducing emission intensity, which is important, but on its own is not going to be sufficient for the types of environmental targets that we're trying to achieve. Nevertheless, there are many different pathways that we can look at that could be contributing to a more sustainable food system in which the livestock would be playing a critical part. There's a range of different technologies that are looking at improved feeds and feed additives. These can increase productivity and at the same time may be able to substantially reduce emissions. Studies have suggested that there's already ample opportunities to look at producing a significant amount of livestock products from low opportunity cost land, and with using circular feeds, which would also then reduce both the impact of food waste, but the direct competition with feed production versus food demand. There's also a range of different technologies that are looking at trying to improve pasture management, which could then allow us to increase the amount of carbon sequestration that's possible on managed pastures. For example, there's some really innovative technologies around virtual fencing, which would potentially allow for increased intensification of pasture management. In fact, we are currently at Cornell working on a project with the Earth-funded Bethos Earth Institute on trying to develop variations of virtual fencing that would be would allow in terms of low and middle income farmers and ranchers to be able to access these types of technologies, which at the moment are too expensive for many in the global south to be able to access. This slide here just gives a sense of some of the different types of innovations that are looking to directly reduce emissions. These include different types of feed additives that try to inhibit the production of methane. There's efforts that are going towards vaccination that could likewise look to reduce emissions at the animal level, as well as its breeding programs, which I'm sure the next panelist will be able to discuss in much greater detail than I can. And then there's also some interesting work that's been looking at different types of seaweeds as potential feeds that could also reduce. All of these, in principle, would have the opportunity to reduce emissions at the animal level, which is one of the key things that we need in terms of reducing total emissions. There's already been some mention about alternative proteins, and I think this is another one of the different types of technologies that might be part of an overall more sustainable agri-food system. These technologies present the opportunity for substantial reductions in emissions, and depending on how other resources are reallocated across the economy, could also see reductions in the use of overall land and water, or at the very least could contribute to more efficient agri-food systems that would allow us to produce more with the same resource use. Alternative proteins have multiple different potential pathways into the future. It's not necessarily clear if they will be something that will strictly replace conventional animal source foods, or if it might be something that might be complementary to animal source foods. Current studies have suggested that consumers who consume alternative proteins are also still consuming meat. So it may be that these are an additional option in the consumption bundle. They reduce consumption of animal source foods, but don't necessarily replace all of it. Some projections have suggested that it could supply up to 60% of future meat demand up to middle of the century, which would not fully replace conventional animal source foods, but could contribute to a reduction in animal source food production globally by about 1/3, which means that we would still need to be looking at different types of technologies that could help us reduce the overall environmental footprint of livestock production. It's also worth noting that alternative proteins in some cases could be complementary products. There's a range of different technologies that are looking at converting different waste streams into novel feeds. These could go into livestock production, could help to reduce some of the burden in terms of land use, and in some cases could even be looked at being combined with conventional animal source foods and different types of processed food products. It's also worth noting that there may be questions in terms of multiple objectives and whether or not any of these technologies will contribute to all of them is an open question. Alternative proteins have their own questions in terms of what their health impacts would be. The novel plant-based alternative proteins, they tend to be quite ultra processed, which there's studies that suggest might have some health implications. Cultured meat in principle would have the same types of health implications that conventional animal source foods do, and which would suggest that if there were a shift towards an Eat Lancet diet, that there probably wouldn't be a market then for future cultured meats, just because of the substantial reductions in meat demand that would be suggested by that diet. Circularity, I think, is a really interesting portfolio of different technologies that could significantly help along a range of different dimensions for improving the sustainability of food systems. Food waste is currently estimated to be responsible for almost 1/4 of total food emissions. A circular system would be able to help reduce these emissions by converting waste into valuable byproducts, whether it's energy, as in the case of Aditi's biodigesters, whether it's producing novel feeds, manure, etc. Circular feeds, as I've mentioned, would help reduce pressure on land use, as well as some of that food feed competition. It would create a range of different types of disruptions, including what would happen in terms of thinking about waste streams going from a cost to potentially becoming of a value-adding byproduct, perhaps making it easier to expand sanitation systems and easing some of the cost burdens of different types of livestock production. Again, as in all of these technologies, it's worth highlighting, none of them are going to be silver bullets, and they come with their own potential trade-offs. And circularity is similar. The types of animals in a livestock system that's focusing on maximizing circularity may not be fully compatible with some of the health recommendations in terms of red meat consumption, as circular feed systems and circular animal production would probably have a much larger role for pork production than maybe would be suggested by an Eat Lancet diet. I'll end here with just highlighting that while there's a range of different portfolio of technologies that are potential solutions that could help move towards a more sustainable food system, it's really critical to be thinking about the adoption and diffusion and adaptation processes that are required for these technologies to get into the hands of farmers, ranchers around the world. Historically, many of these technologies, especially the more high-tech ones, can have substantial lag between the idea generation and when it actually gets into the field and is applied, with small holders and more vulnerable communities often being the last to have access to these types of technologies and innovations, suggesting that we really need to have more focus on this adoption process, finding ways to de-risk adoption for these more vulnerable farmers, as well as creating enabling environments that helps to shield people from some of the negative consequences that some of these technologies might have, particularly in terms of effects on labor. We really need to look at ways of investing and improve social safety nets so that these technologies can be de-risked a bit to overall society.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Mason de Cross. Thank you very much for the crucial information that you've just provided. I will now give the floor to our next speaker, Professor Alison van Enenam. She is a distinguished professor of comparative extension, animal biotechnology, and genomics from the Department of Animal Science at the University of California, Davis. She holds a bachelor's degree in agricultural science from the University of Melbourne in Australia, and she also has a master's in animal science and a PhD in genetics from UC Davis. She has been working on topics related to animal biotechnology, genomics, and livestock genetic improvement for the past 25 years. Thank you very much, Professor, and you will now have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Just give me a thumbs up if you can see my slide okay.
Yes, perfect.
All right, very good. Well, good morning from Australia, actually, where I am, and it's already tomorrow, so things are looking good so far. And thank you for the opportunity to speak at this GASL event. I have not interacted with this group before, and I think have many shared interests with a lot of the discussions here today. As was mentioned, I work in the field of genetics and specifically genomics and genetic improvement of livestock, and that's where I've focused my lab work at the university for the last 25 years or so. But I think it's important to look a little bit too at where I came from, which is originally from Australia, and did a Bachelor of Agricultural Science as my training and foray into agriculture. And I think this is such an important background for a lot of these discussions, because a degree like that really talks not only about the animals, but their interaction with the environment. And a lot of what are now being called sustainable management practices are actually just what we were taught as best management practices in the agricultural science degree. It's almost like it's some of these technologies are being rediscovered, if you will. And although I'll talk a little bit about some of the fancier genetic and genomics technologies, I really do think a lot of the improvements and sustainability kind of innovations that need to be adopted are actually well known, well trodden genetic improvement that just hasn't really been distributed to the entire global community. And so I've been very pleased to hear people mention extension. That's actually what my job is. And so I actually do work out in the field with farmers and ranchers of all sizes and all types to implement genetic improvement programs. And I think that that's really where the rubber meets the road. And I think what I see is a really important aspect of trying to adopt more sustainable production systems is really knowledge transfer of best management practices to farmers and meeting them where they are in terms of what they can actually implement and trying to meet their goals whilst also improving their overall efficiencies, which of course reduces the emissions intensity. And if we look at countries where that's happened, it's happened where you've had a combination of public investment, extension services to allow the adoption of these technologies. So we've spoken a lot about cattle at this meeting, and there are other animals in the food supply, but I guess my area is cattle, and so I'm going to talk about cattle and just having a look at where the 1.5 billion cattle are located around the world. And this graph is a recent graph that kind of does it by density, and the countries that have particularly large cattle populations are darker in color, but really they're everywhere. And whether we're talking the Americas or Africa or Asia, they're located in all sorts of environments, in all sorts of pastoral systems. And I couldn't concur more strongly with the statements that there's no one system here that's going to work for everybody, and it's very much dependent on the environment as to what is going to be sustainable production practices in those particular environments. But I do think it's important to have a look at where the growth in these populations are occurring. And this is just a graph that shows increases in cattle number by FAO regions from 1961 to 2021, so over the last 60 years or so. And what's shown in blue was kind of what the numbers were in 1961. And what's shown in orange is the additional numbers that have been added since 1961. And so what you see is there's been very large increases in cattle populations in Africa, less so in Asia, although Asia started at a fairly high rate. And in fact, and of course in the Americas, and that's primarily driven by Brazil and Mexico. And then what you see in Europe actually is they've gone down 78 million head from 1961 to the current time, and then a small increase here in Oceania. And what you see, if you actually look at the growth in these cattle populations, where that growth is occurring is not in high income countries. There's been pretty much no change. In fact, in many countries like Europe, there's actually been decreasing numbers of cattle. And in the dairy cattle population in the US, for example, there's been a decrease from, I think, about 28 million back in the 1950s to 9 million today, because the improvements in the productivity of those animals has meant that we're able to provide that animal source protein using less animals to produce the same amount of product. And so a lot of the cattle growth and populations is occurring in some of the developing countries. And in fact, if we look at where a lot of the growth is, it's occurring in upper middle income, lower middle income, low income countries. And the red here is a subset of the list above there, but the least developed countries has incredible cattle growth. And I think the countries with the most growth are listed here in terms of cattle heads increases. And you can see it's in the Americas, it's in Asia, it's in Africa. And to me, this is where there's a lot of opportunity to actually adopt best management practices that we know reduce emissions intensity in these countries that at the moment do not have very productive systems. And so I'm going to talk about genetics today, and I'm a geneticist. I love genetics. I'd love to say that it's the silver bullet that will solve all our problems, but of course the three intersecting components of animal science are not only genetics, but nutrition and animal health, and really they go together in addition to management to improve the efficiency of ruminants. So today I'm just going to speak about breeding and just how improved genetics can actually basically reduce the overall emissions of livestock. And this is kind of a summary of what I spend my life doing, which is basically genetic improvement. And there are kind of interacting sections here. It's not only genetic improvement using selection, but it's also intersecting with some of the other technologies like genomic selection and advanced reproductive technologies. And one of the more recent additions is gene editing, which I won't even talk about today because I think that's a very sophisticated technology. And really what I want to emphasize is the way to move ahead in genetics at the beginning, irrespective of anything else, is you need a structured breeding program with a clear breeding objective. And if you look at countries that have been able to get genetic improvement, what that started with was phenotype collection, maybe collecting milk yield, if you will, or how much each cow produces in milk. And those data going into a centralized database that was often subsidized by the government. And that enabled the development then of genetic estimates of who was a superior cow or bull. And then you could start selecting and making improvements in genetic gain. And that's going to be very much dictated by how accurately you can predict the best animal, whether you can use very elite males intensely through things like artificial insemination, how much genetic variation you have available in your population, and how young you can use animals in your breeding program. So you want to have the youngest, best animals as your genetic selection candidates. And this rate of genetic gain is very much driven by all that. But if you don't have good measurements and a structured breeding program to know which are your best animals to use, then the rest of it's kind of moot. And that's a really important component and something that needs to be established in order to make genetic improvements. And it's a very basic, it's not very sexy, it doesn't use robots or AI or genome editing, but without that, you really can't make genetic improvements. And really extension to kind of help establish those types of breeding programs is very important. And so there has been, and I was kind of looking at some of the countries with very large cattle populations, for example, India, which has a very large cattle population, so about 192 million cattle in India. It's the largest dairy producing nation in the world. And also, of course, there's quite a large buffalo population there, which doesn't get counted in the cattle, but there's collectively there's about 300 million animals. And what we see over time is from the 1950s to the current time, there's been a tremendous increase in the production of milk or dairy products in this country. And what we see there synergistically coming along here is artificial insemination doses. And now there's 75 million artificial insemination doses. And what that enabled was an increase in the yield per cow, or cow and buffalo. And so although there's been this 187 million increase in animal numbers, there's been a 1,105% increase in milk production. And some of that, going from 17 million metric tons, sorry, this was milk here, 17 million metric tons to 187, has been enabled by the superior genetics that's been enabled by the use of AI. And so this is a relatively simple technology. So using elite males that we know are best in frozen semen that is then used to inseminate the cows has really enabled a tremendous increase in production. And of course, what that enables then is you can produce more milk with the same number of cows, or if you want to look at it another way, you can produce you can produce the same amount of milk with less cows, and that is basically the trajectory that has occurred when we've had these advanced breeding programs. And then of course you can add genomic selection, etc. on top of that. Having said that, although there's good progress here, there's a really nice paper from the National Academy of Sciences in India that said, despite all of this investment, there's only 30% of people using AI, and it still has a fairly low conception rate because of issues related to actually translating this into the field. So the delivering AI, the absence of a mechanism to ensure the use of semen from the very best animals, absence of mandatory system for AI, and relatively poor control over AI technicians. And there's a number of technical issues that make it quite difficult to adopt AI. And these, to me, are the types of issues that can be dealt with extension and public funding to help adopt these types of technologies. And that's one of the key obstacles, I think, that are hindering the widespread adoption of these types of technologies in livestock farming. Let's shift from a very large dairy country to a very large beef country. And this is Brazil now, with its 250 million or so beef animals or cattle. And here they've been able to use timed AI programs to use better genetics using AI in the beef industry. But again, only about 12% of the Brazilian beef herd is actually artificially inseminated. And there's tremendous opportunity again here to use superior genetics and AI, or even just timed natural breeding, where you could actually use innovations to synchronize those cows and get them bred earlier to actually have a shorter time from exposure to the bull to when they're calving. That could be represent, and if you could do that with the 88% of the Brazilian beef herd that are not using artificial inseminations, just basically synchronizing their heats could present an opportunity to have much more efficient production and an extra 4.8 million calves per year, according to this estimate that was published in Animal. And again, the barriers that can be overcome, especially in the context of farmers with limited resources, is extension in the case of the Indian dairy industry. So these authors suggest that researchers and extension experts are needed to work with the farmers to help bring the benefits of AI to the dairy sector. And further, scientists have to analyze the problems faced by farmers and find suitable solutions to help with diffusion and adoption of AI in field conditions. And this study recommends participatory technology generation and transfer, so working with the farmers, finding out what their problems are, and then working out how those problems can be solved to transfer these innovations to the dairy farmers. And in the Brazilian beef industry, there's obviously a big opportunity to use improved genetics in those that aren't using it. And it's estimated in this particular study that if we were able to do that, there would obviously be improvements in efficiency, and increasing the productivity per unit of land actually has the effect of basically reducing the overall environmental impact because it reduces the emissions. And so I'm a big fan of genetics because the results are permanent and cumulative in that once you have genetically improved livestock, you don't need to keep putting inputs into it. They are going to be genetically improved. And so it's a long-term investment, one that often needs public support. And many of the large global cattle populations are now in low and middle income countries. And I think there's a real need to basically develop improved breeding programs. And it's been estimated in a 2021 study that if livestock production efficiencies in the 10 countries with the largest emissions reduction potential, and they're listed here in this slide, if they were able to have improved production efficiencies, this could contribute to a 60 to 65% reduction in the global livestock emissions by 2025, compared to a baseline where emission intensities are held constant in the future. And so I think that I realize I have my bias, but genetic improvement is a key driver to this. And I think that trying investment to improve genetics is going to be a long-term win for sustainability and also for the farmers that are raising those livestock in these countries. So I will finish there.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the information. We, as a result of both of your presentations, we will now continue to a session on discussing some of these elements that you have proposed. We will first share the elements that we have been receiving through the Slido on the impressions of this brainstorming session on what are the key drivers and the elements. As you can see here, indeed, genetics is one of the elements or what people have identified to be one of the most influential drivers for innovation. So as Professor Van Enneman has mentioned, of course, genetics is one of those. But I think it's also interesting to mention, for example, some of the comments that we've had on, for example, someone mentioned the Indian example, mentioning that crossbreeding does not do well in hot tropical climate with a greater number of hot days due to climate change. Crossbreeding uses temperature, breeds are likely to undergo more stress. So here are some of the questions and first impressions that we're receiving in this concern. And we also have other, apart from genetics, culture meats or meat culture, digitalization, and some other elements here. For this new session, we will allot 25 minutes for audience reactions. We encourage everyone to participate not only through the Slido, but also through the chat. This session will also be moderated by Mr. Peso, who is joining us now. And I will pose Again, 3 questions for our panelists, and I would appreciate both to be able to comment on these. The first one is, in what ways technologies such as livestock management, genomics, and precision feeding could help enhance the efficiency of livestock production? The second one, what are the key obstacles hindering the widespread adoption of such technologies in livestock farming? And the third one, on how these barriers could be overcome, especially in the context of farmers with limited resources. For this, I will give the floor also to Mr. Peso, and of course to both of our panelists. Feel free to react to any of these 3 questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariel. Thank you to the 2 presenters, Dr. Mason and Dr. Van Inneman, for very interesting presentations. I would like to, before going to the questions that the public is contributing, I would like to make a couple of questions. One to Dr. Mason, and the other one to Dr. Van Inneman. Dr. Mason has mentioned that because of the increase in population and probably because of the increase of income also of the families, we are expecting increase in demand of food. Then the question will be, do you think that if we apply intensification using better technologies in the areas already devoted to livestock production could be enough? Or do we need to promote change of diets?
Well, I guess it's a bit of a question in terms of what the overall goals are. I think if we look at sort of what the targets that are needed in terms of reductions of emissions from the food system to achieve the Paris Agreement, we're looking at least 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions reduction annually, and with livestock contributing about half of FOLU emissions. The question is, can the technologies that we're talking about, can they be adopted and applied at such a rate that we could drive down emissions that much and in the timescales that we're looking at? And sort of how much are we going to require sort of innovation technology to carry the burden on reducing environmental footprint? I think in principle that it's possible that technologies could do it, but I think in reality, if we're trying to achieve these really ambitious targets by these really ambitious timelines, we probably need to be doing all of the above, where we need all of the technologies that Allison was highlighting, plus other technologies, plus also looking at ways of trying to reduce consumption, particularly in high-income countries where we are clearly over-consuming meat, and it's causing negative health outcomes. And so the reductions in meat consumption are perhaps less relevant in many countries and contexts in the global South than they are in more westernized diets. But I think ultimately, because the goals that we're trying to achieve from an environmental perspective are really big, we probably do need to have all of the above technologies, as well as looking at finding ways of reducing some of the pressures by also making the diets more sustainable.
Thank you. Dr. Van Inneman, in the previous, when we opened the questions for the previous presentation, there were a person who mentioned the problems of the disappearance of the local breeds, and how important are the local breeds for the genetic improvement programs in the developing world, particularly considering climate change?
I think that depends on the local breed. So if they're well adapted to that environment and are productive to produce food, then they're going to be highly important. And often, for example, Bos Indicus cattle are better adapted to hot climates than Bos Taurus cattle. And so, bringing a Bos Taurus into a hot environment's not going to work well. But having said that, there is genetic improvement that is happening. And if there are improved breeds that produce more food, then that's going to be important for the purpose of those livestock, which is producing food. So I think it depends a little bit, and there are certainly opportunities to have selection programs on native cattle and get the best of the native cattle, if you will, to be the ones whose bulls you use to spread his genetics, is the better genetics. And so that's kind of how we developed our breeds in the first place, was through breed associations, gathering the data and then getting a pedigree recording, and then we worked out who the best animals were. And without data, you just, all you got is something that looks, you don't have anything to know whether it's better. And so that accuracy of selecting the best animals is a really important component of a better breeding program, whatever your definition of better is.
Thank you. Let's see if there are some questions, Mariel. And
we have several questions, actually. This one we have from the YOLDA initiative. It says, given the prevailing global challenges, particularly those concerning biodiversity loss, how should the goal of genetic interventions and breeding programs be redefined? Is it still appropriate to primarily emphasize production yield enhancement as the benchmark for measuring efficiency in genetics? And perhaps I will allow Professor Van Enneman to answer this question.
Well, I think it's an important one, but if you've got a productive animal that can't get bred or is reproductively incompetent or gets sick all the time or drops dead, then you haven't really got a very productive animal. So I think and if you look at our breeding objectives in the breeding program, dairy cattle in America, for example, there's very little emphasis put on production per se. What we want is an optimal animal that is both able to get bred and has a long life and doesn't get sick, and also produces lots of milk and, or in this case, protein and fat. So I think that it's still important, and actually the low yield is associated with needing more animals to produce whatever product it is you're producing. And so the yield and the concomitant reduction in emissions intensity is actually a really important aspect here. And when you do have increased yield, what we've seen is that enables you to reduce the populations whilst still producing product. And so I think there's a very important sustainability discussion to be had around the importance of yield and the impact that has on emissions intensity.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Mason?
Well, I would second everything Alison just said, but I would also say that we need to consider technologies a bit like we do policies in terms of like sort of the Tinbergen rule. So if we have multiple objectives, it's unreasonable to expect a technology to be able to answer on all of them. And so we need to have bundles of technologies and policies that allow us to sort of maximize the benefits and reduce the negatives. So the genetics is, as Alice was saying, absolutely critical in terms of increasing productivity, which in principle, if we don't change demand, would allow us to reduce resource use through improved efficiency and productivity. And then what we need to do to make sure that we don't have a rebound on demand is that we have other technologies and policies that are implemented to assure that we do that protection. So if we free up land because of more productive livestock systems, then we need to also have policies that encourage protection of land so that biodiverse spaces are not encroached on. So I think it's one where we have to be realistic in terms of no technology on its own will solve all of these different objectives, and we have to combine them and so that we can kind of maximize the benefit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mason. And I think this might be related to the next question is, well, this person agrees with the importance of genetics, but mentions the difficulty in some countries, specifically in the developing countries, of government's not investing much in these types of development. And I think it goes to the point of Mr. Mason on policy, right? So perhaps from your experiences, and the question says, how should we go about when there are limited resources? So perhaps some experiences or country cases where this type of things is happening. I would leave the floor to either one of you.
Are you're talking about setting up breeding programs, basically? I mean, there's certainly work that's being attempted in that regard, but there are still many countries that don't have a formalized, basically, performance recording infrastructure set up such that you can actually get the records to put together a breeding program. And I know ILRI, for example, does a lot of work in this area, and there is some funding for African dairy from, I think, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So there is some efforts in that regard, but it's not very sexy. You know, it doesn't attract funding, I think, because it's kind of not very sexy. And it, unfortunately, you know, if you look at historically how we developed efficient breeding programs in the kind of the developed world, it was government supported, and in the beginning was putting together the Dairy Herd Improvement Association, for example. That was all, used to be the land grant universities collected all that data and crunched the numbers. And so it's getting that infrastructure in place. But the payback is, it's an expensive investment, but the payback is phenomenal over time. Really good return on investment, but it tends to be public funding.
Thank you, Professor. Going back to the question of productivity in animals, someone has a question on maybe clarifying the concept of production, or it says in the global south, animals have multiple purposes and food production is just one of them. So they're wondering how this can be defined to address the drivers from technology.
That's such a good question, because yeah, a lot of the LCAs have a very kind of, you know, myopic view of a cow is a steak, and it's like, no, it's not just a steak. It's like lots more than that. It's manure, it's draft power, it's milk. You know, I think, what is it, like half the cattle are dairy mixed. You know, they're both meat and milk, and then hides and all the rest of it. And I think that nuance is often lost in these metrics that are very myopic in terms of, oh, well, you know, in my view, a cow is a hamburger. Well, there's so much more than a hamburger, and all the ecosystem services, and it's very hard to quantify and put that into numbers, I think. And so it does that kind of singularity focus on yield really it doesn't adequately capture the value of ruminants in our global food systems, both from a food production, but also from the ecosystem services they provide and the livelihoods they provide to the billion plus livestock keepers throughout the globe.
Thank you, Professor. From the chat, I also see here that Mr. Awali has provided some links to research projects, African dairy genetics gains. For those people who are interested, you can access more information there. Many people are agreeing with the fact that these issues need holistic approaches, mobilizing various tools. And perhaps I would like to ask both of you, what, in your opinion, how do you think artificial intelligence can influence livestock systems? Do you see this as a solution, a barrier, and under the understanding that, as Mr. Mason said, there is no one solution that can address all issues, but perhaps your perspectives on these tools?
We're talking AI as in artificial intelligence, not artificial insemination. We had that acronym before the AI people even thought about it. So I feel like I'm going to claim ownership of that, but I will discuss artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence works when you've got data to train it on. So if you haven't got any data to train it on, it's not going to be that useful. However, having said that, I think there is some aspects of animal breeding where it might have some utility, although I think there was a recent paper came out from University of Queensland here looking at how AI might interact with breeding programs. And in fact, our existing algorithms do a pretty good job of estimating the accuracy of animals better than actually artificial intelligence does. So I think maybe some data collection aspects to develop the phenotypes we need to develop new breeding selection criteria for animals might be where it plays in. But at the end of the day, all of that builds on an existing breeding program. If you don't have that fundamentals in place and you don't have a breeding program in place, then adding more phenotypes doesn't get you anywhere. So you've got to set that fundamental up before you can kind of go to that next level. So I think it's got a use, but I think there are some really low hanging fruit that's a lot simpler than AI to just get systems going. I'll let Daniel.
Yeah, I would second that. I think in terms of, I mean, as a potential tool that can increase our efficiency of sort of assessing different sources of data and maybe connecting different types of data in ways that would have previously been difficult or very time consuming to do. I think it has the potential of maybe making things more efficient. I do think though the point that you need data to train them is actually really important also with some of the questions I've been noticing coming up in the chat around local and indigenous knowledge, that how that information could be collected and whether that would feed into any sort of AI, I think is a really big question. And I suspect what would often happen would be AI would continue to train on the same type of data that we've been looking at, so that what we would probably have from what just said was maybe a marginal improvement, but maybe not like a real step improvement on some of the changes that current algorithms are already pretty good at identifying. But then it will just reinforce some of sort of the missing pieces that we're currently maybe not capturing by not, unless we actually actively go out and collect more information on local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. I don't see, this may help on parts of the problem, but it's probably not going to help on everything.
Thank you both. We have another question here. So many so-called local knowledge systems used by farmers are often actually fairly sound technical innovations, but are dismissed because they do not emerge from research labs. Perhaps how do you account for these systems? Is one of the questions that we have. I would allow either one of you to answer this. So specifically relating to local knowledge systems, and we also have here someone mentioning that in the Netherlands, many farmers have started reintroducing local breeds, three-way crossbreeding programs, so more of local practices.
I mean, I think that this is a really difficult question to sort of answer, because in part it's about us starting to be more holistic and more open to sort of defining the different types of questions that we're looking at. What is science? What is information? What is data? And I think one of the issues here is that we need to sort of expand a little bit and sort of recognize that there is knowledge generation that's happening outside of sort of what we think of maybe the conventional setup. But I think maybe seconding Allison's point, I think we need to invest a whole lot more in extension. And extension needs to be seen not only as a one-way flow of information, but extension offices are also really well suited to sort of see some of the local adaptation that they can then collect that information and share it more broadly. So I think one of the key aspects here is really increasing our attention to another unsexy aspect of technology and development, but that is absolutely critical in terms of diffusion of knowledge and that adaptation adoption process. We need to invest more in extension.
Yeah, I guess I just say, and it kind of goes to this question here about community-based breeding programs. If you look at the history of the Angus breed or the Hereford breed or whichever, it was started off with a group of farmers who said, "This is what I like. I like black cattle, or I like red cattle with white faces." Whatever, they developed what they thought was a good animal, and that to me is kind of how breeding programs come about. Is like there's a group of local farmers that say this is what we call a genetically superior animal, and it may not be the highest yielding, but it may be one that's particularly resistant to, I don't know, sleeping sickness or whatever. And I think that's where you have to have the input of the farmers as to what it is that that they value and what they see as something that they want in their system, and even if it's just an appearance of a black coat or whatever. And so I think that's historically how they have developed. It wasn't science telling them that they had to have that. That was coming directly from the farmers. And I think if you're telling them, I don't think it'll work if you're telling the farmers what sort of system or what sort of cattle they have to have. If they don't like it, they won't use it. So I think you have to work with them, or you're going to produce a product they won't want.
Indeed, thank you very much, Professor. I would like to give the word also to Mr. Peso, if you have some concluding observations from our panelists.
Okay, okay. Let me make a few comments after these presentations. I really appreciate the contributions. Are very, very thoughtful ideas that you share with us. But one of the comments I will have first regarding this technology innovations that Daniel was mentioning. And many times we talk about the importance of improving management of pastures, which is definitely one of the options for increasing resilience and not only productivity, but resilience and mitigation. But one of the things that we frequently forget is that at least 50% of the pastures are degraded. Then before doing changes on, before having impacts of improved management, what we need is to rehabilitate degraded lands, degraded pastures. No, and then we can go to the other opportunities. And I think we have some data that shows the benefits of doing this from the economical and ecological point of view. The second thing is regarding these alternative proteins. Daniel Mason was mentioning that culture meat probably will not fit with the requirements of the eat-lunch diets, no, which I think is quite correct. But also we have to think what is the case of if this type of proteins will be accepted for kosher on halal diets, and a large population in the world is at least Muslim, and Jewish also are part of it. But one of the other thing that I want to mention is I have not seen many studies on the acceptance of these alternative proteins. Because we need to consider the willingness to buy and the willingness to eat, compared to the traditional animal food sources of protein. That is one my comment. And regarding this genetics work, I think it is quite interesting. But I'm not sure if I know enough on what is the work has been done on producing animals that have lower greenhouse gas intensity, lower greenhouse gas emissions intensities. I think there are some work on that direction, but not much. Definitely on in terms of adaptation to heat stress and this type of things, there is more work. But I wonder if through genomics, there are some opportunities on that direction.
I can answer that one. Yes, there are groups around the world that are working towards selecting for low methane sheep, for example, in New Zealand. There's a project there. There's also groups that are trying to identify just low methane producing cattle. Having said that, the biggest contributor is actually the overall yield. That's like, even maybe you have a 5% less methane emitting animal. If you look at that relative to the yield effect of emissions intensity, that's that kind of blows everything else out of the water. And so although I'm all supportive of that, I think that it's important to look at what the impact of overall efficiency is. And that really is the key driver. That's, if you look at throughout the globe, that's what's really pushing the emissions intensity.
Thank you very much, Professor. Mr. Mason, do you want to some final words?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think responding to Danila's question, I think, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of whether or not consumers will consider alternative proteins as viable options. I think there's already a fair amount of evidence to suggest that at least some consumers are happy to try the novel plant-based alternatives, at least as sort of an additional component of their consumption bundle. Whether or not it's replacing conventional animal source foods is still, I think, to be seen. Culture meat is a bit too soon to really know, as it hasn't really come onto the market in a way that we can find. But it's correct to ask, because if consumers reject the product, then it will have no impact. I mean, full stop, right? If consumers decide that these are products that they do not think are something that they want to consume, then they will, you know, go into the dustbin of history as an interesting idea that never really bore fruit. If they do get adopted, and then of course there's a wide range where it could be a small niche product to it being a massive disruptor, we would need to sort of think about those would have different implications in terms of resource use, labor, et cetera. The cultural aspects, I think, are important. I mean, there's even questions around certain religious groups, whether the plant-based alternatives might be questionable because they might encourage you wanting to consume products that are religiously considered off limits. And so the practices themselves might have issues, but I think it's also worth noting just how flexible societies and humans are in terms of changing what they think is and isn't acceptable over time. So it's really hard to predict what might happen. And from a livestock perspective, I suppose it's mostly about thinking about what types of challenges and opportunities and what would a future livestock system need to look like to compete with some of these. And I think thinking about the holistic aspect is also important. Livestock systems are not just hamburgers floating around, you know, somewhere on a GIS map. They have a whole lot of other characteristics that are valuable to societies, culturally, economically, socially. And so there might be a strong role for certain types of livestock systems, even in a world where there's a substantial amount of adoption of cultured meat and novel plant-based alternatives. So I think these things are likely to coexist in different formats depending on a range of different issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mason. Mr. Peso, if you would like just some concluding remarks. And then,
yes, I just want to add something that came to my mind after reading some of the comments regarding technology innovations. Probably we will talk about management of pastures and this type of things as important innovations, but it's also very important to mention the work that is being done on the selection and genetic work on forages, tropical forages, especially by CIAT and ILRI, and with different purposes. First of all, is adaptation to constraints, environmental constraints, the problems of diseases, resistance to pests and diseases and these type of things, the resistance to salinity, to drought, and these type of things that are very much related to the last one, very much related to climate change, but also their work on improving the quality of these pastures that will have an effect on reducing emissions of methane, basically. And it's also mentioned by one of the participants in these discussions. With that, I think the only thing I have is to thank the two presenters of this section of the webinar and to the organizers for inviting me to make some comments on these presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peso. And I would again also like to thank our panelists for the second session of today. And as we wrap up today's session, this is the time that we have allocated for today. We'll have some insights into what are the next steps that we are addressing for this series of webinars. Just as a reminder that the main learnings and takeaways messages will feed the discussion of the 8th GASL regional consultation that will take place around the world in the next 6 weeks, from the 8th of September to the 17th of October, in preparation for the 13th GASL global meeting in Chiang Mai, Thailand, from the 30th of October to the 3rd of November. The regional consultations will address the effects of drivers of change on livestock systems, the best solutions to deal with drivers' pressures, and how multi-stakeholder action can collaborate with the implementation of solutions to keep sustainability and enhance resilience of livestock systems. And a group of representatives of each region will bring their main messages to the global discussion in Chiang Mai, Thailand. The regional consultations, I will share with you here what are the dates for the regional consultations that will be both virtually and hybrid and are scheduled as follows. And here's some of the information you can see for Oceania, for Latin America and the Caribbean, for Western Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia. For Africa, we also have Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We have for China and North America is still to be confirmed. So these are some of the information for the regional consultations that are coming up. And also, I would like to remind everyone that we have our next webinars, which will be webinars 2 and 3 for health and disease drivers. And we will have this one for Thursday, September the 7th. And we will still have it at the same time as today's session. You can also find in the chat the information for the third one on geopolitical and social economic drivers, which will be Monday, September the 11th. And you can access the link for both of them via the chat. Again, I would like to thank everyone for joining on this session and everyone who has participated with your insights and questions. And indeed, this has been a very productive session. On behalf of GASL and of course, Katia, we would like to thank you for joining us today and hope you have either a good day, good evening, or rest of the day. And hopefully you will join us in our next webinars. Thank you very much.